Hi everyone, I hope you're all doing well. My name is Lena and I'm really excited to be talking to you today. I'm an artist and illustrator currently graduating from OCAD. Right now I am living and working and speaking to you from land that is home to Indigenous nations, which include the Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nations, and the Métis Nation. I also want to thank the Hand-Eye Society and Toronto Comic Arts Festival for holding this event. I feel really grateful for the opportunity to speak about one of my great passions in life, which is fan comics. So, to give you a bit of background, I have been making and independently distributing zines since I was 15. And at the same time, I became interested in game development through a game development club at my high school and started participating in game jams. So, I would say I dabble at an amateur level in games and have a little more fluency in comics, but I love both media and the different ways they tell stories by playing with the relationship between image and text, interactivity, and time. I think it's also important for me to note that many of these observations and statements are produced from my own personal experiences in fan spaces and creating fan works. So, that being said, if there's anything you want to chat about, you agree with me about something, disagree about something, please let me know in the chat if you're watching live, or you can shoot me an email if you prefer that instead. I am always really curious to hear what you're obsessed with and what your relationship to games and fan culture is. Okay, let's get started. So, what does it mean to be a fan? Even though I was a big fangirl as a youth of not only video games, but also like anime, cartoons, comics, you name it, I find it kind of difficult to get a clear picture of the way fan culture has influenced my life and the way I love things. And this is because it sometimes feels like every experience I had with narrative media was highly personal and specific, almost like me as a person and the media property itself had forged like a special relationship with each other. And in interpreting the work a certain way, it almost was like I was letting that story see into a part of my life. It felt very personal to me. Of course, I also love talking to other people about the things I was obsessed with, and that joy that we would share together. And it made me happy in some ways to know that I wasn't the only one who saw or had been seen um, by this game or movie or TV series or whatever it was. But at the same time, I almost also felt like it was mutually understood that while we are talking about the same game or the same show, we're both fans of the same thing. Me and maybe another person who's also really into this game or TV show were like seeing and reading into different things. So, what's beautiful about a narrative is that the diverse identities and life experiences of that group of fans will bring out different parts and different details of the story. And what's so beautiful about a game specifically is that this difference is really evident in the media itself. You're literally controlling the behavior of the player in the game. In a lot of narrative work, there's like multiple endings too. So everyone's quote unquote journey in a game is necessarily different by virtue of that like level of interactivity. So, with that being said, I think that being a fan actually comes with a certain level of alienation. So, obviously, there's the community that builds from a collective love for something, especially now that we're all interconnected via the internet. You don't even need to be local anymore. Um, but there's also some alienation you feel because of like your personal relationship to the work, along with feeling alienation from that culture at large or from the people in your real and immediate life. And I think the reason why this alienation is felt so strongly is because what stories do, and especially games, is that they build you a new reality to live in. Like games throw you into a whole new world that you feel like you've like built your home in and that you have real life stakes in. So in some sense, games and other media works transposing their worlds onto how you experience reality is already extensively discussed and well documented, which completely makes sense. given that games are designed keeping in mind how we might naturally interact with our real life environment. So why wouldn't that relationship kind of be reciprocal? Like, why wouldn't those worlds build off of each other? Game transfer phenomena was coined by Angelica Oritz and Gotari Mark Griffiths, who found that there was academic documentation dating back to 1993 of how people couldn't get songs, symbols, colors, motions from games out of their head even when they were no longer playing. And it's kind of this extension of the Tetris effect where those colorful Tetris blocks continue to like twist and fall and stack up in your vision even when you're not playing the game. So if this is just happening with like just surface level UI, lights and sounds, and like artificial things like that, then I do also wonder how the deeper elements of the games, with like fully fleshed out worlds and narratives, change the way we are present in the world, or even change the way we experience memory. So I can think of times where I've lost myself so completely in a game that like I'm in some fucked up haze, sort of struggling to return to reality afterwards and like reintegrate into society. It really does feel like crawling out of the womb because interactive narrative work can immerse you so fully into the worlds they've created and generate emotional investment very deeply and very quickly through its mechanics. Um, so I guess one way of thinking about it is it's kind of like being in a really intensely dependent monogamous relationship that is also really brief because it colors everything you see and do outside of that relationship. Um, and you always think about things outside of that relationship in relation to what you've experienced inside it. And that makes you feel weird because you might feel like you're the only person who understands what it's like to be like really immersed in this game world. Um, I also think it's difficult to talk about how fandom is experienced and stigmatized without talking about gender and sexuality. So I'm really curious to hear what your experiences may be. But personally, I've noticed that you can draw a gender line between the different ways people experience and express devotion to a certain fan group. Um, so when we think of obsession and fixation, maybe the first thing that comes to mind is like K-pop stans or like 2010 era believers or directioners or like geishas, or something else that conjures up feminine obsession as like a self-consuming frivolous ordeal. The obsession is not driven by competition or some kind of promise of material gain or conquest, which are things often associated with cis hetero masculine obsession. So in this case, if we are not obsessing towards some kind of leverage, or some kind of power, then what are we doing it for? In fact, because of the gender stigma around fandom and obsession, coupled with the fact that being completely devoted to something can feel alienating, there is some shame associated with expressing our love for some static, self contained narrative. How can you be in love with something that isn't real? I mean, a video game can't really love you back. So maybe that's what's so alienating about fandom is that our love is mediated by a personal and visceral fantasy. Creating fan work is a way of making that fantasy public and known so that you can be like, see, I don't look so crazy anymore. Like, this is how it feels to be in love with something. I would argue that some forms of fan work function to prove that there is a logic behind this like intense emotional reaction. It brings the context of the game or the media property back into the world that we share, um, and allows readers to be empathetic in that way. There are, of course, other reasons to make fan work, and everybody has their own. I'm just graduating from art school, so I feel like in that sphere, making fan work is something viewed as corny. The university is an extension of this general Western ideology in some sense, an ideology of artwork that is rooted in championing originality and looks down upon the derivative. But I really think that work that is explicitly derivative or that builds upon pre-existing work is adding to the conversation and lifespan of that original in like a really beautiful way. So fan work could be conceived of also as an object to add to a collective shrine, like a fandom is building or producing something together, and fan work is one form of that community building. Um, Keep in mind that while my theories for why we love to create fan work are largely just wild speculation, I like to think that I have some firsthand experience in the matter. Fanzines and fan comics are a form of fan work that is near and dear to my heart, and I'm going to be spending the rest of my time talking about how they operate and why they're so great, and just some little things I've noticed about some of my favorite pieces. So I want to briefly first discuss my process. Flowers Look Like Weeds was the first proper fanzine I made, and I can speak a little to why I made it. I worked on it over the course of about 2 weeks, right when quarantine started about a year ago, and it stemmed from a collection of observations about both a relationship that I had recently ended and the relationship I had with casual farming adjacent games like Animal Crossing and Stardew Valley. I guess I saw the visual language of how these, well, I guess I saw the visual language of these games, um, and that they could be used as vessels for like personal thoughts. And that's kind of how I approached the creation of this zine. So most pages in the zine feature this avatar who represents me in some ways, and the continuity between images would phase between the visual languages of Animal Crossing, Stardew Valley, and like reality. So in doing this, I think that I was trying to speak in two different ways. I wanted to speak to why doing these like silly, soothing, repetitive games or playing these games represents so much to us. But I think I also wanted to use these games to help me and kind of act as a guideline for how I could process something I didn't fully understand. Um, and when everything feels meaningless, it kind of helps to have this simulated reality present you with like a pre-existing narrative and set of tasks to accomplish every day. You know, you complete something, you get a reward. Like it can be really comforting in that way. And I wanted to depict that in my work. So, in addition to connecting yourself with a larger community and changing the life and meaning of the original game, I think that the practice of producing fan work can be used as a kind of divination, like to make sense of personal experiences that seem random or confusing or painful, because making a story that directly responds to the game narrative imbues our memory of both playing the game and our real life experiences with something special. It's a form of reflective work that can reshape our memories in that way. And that's a real show of faith in that original game that is really lovely to see and experience. So I think I've talked enough about my creator side of fan comics. Now I want to talk a little about some notable fan comics that are responses or homages to video games or use the video game almost as like the theoretical framework for the narrative. And there are lots of fanzines that are like art books or image collections for fan work, but I want to focus on narrative fanzines that were generated by one author because I think they have something to tell us about how we chronicle our personal lives into stories as well, though not all of them are autobiographical. Um, Plus, I think a narrative framework is interesting because it sort of mirrors the narrative inherently present in games. Since game narratives are built through interactions over time, comics can mirror this form using panels to build like a time-based sequence. So that's interesting to think about as well. So the first comic I want to talk about is called Letters to an Absent Father by Mare Odomo. And this is one of the first zines I ever got my paws on. I think my brother gave this to me after buying it from TCAF in like 2011 or something. The style is really simple, really chill, and the strips are short. It's a Pokemon fanzine, though not explicitly branded as one. I don't think I'm not sure if any of the ones that I'm talking about are explicitly branded as fanzines, but they count. The game mechanics of Pokemon itself are like really simple and repetitive, and it's about collecting animals. And the anime follows this similar sort of formula from what I can recall. The main narrative of Pokemon is to beat all the gym leaders, collect all the Pokemon, and be the best in the world, which is pretty simple. But what Mare Odomo decides to dive into, interrogate, flesh out, explore, are the pre-existing narrative details about this franchise uh, that the franchise seems to treat as natural, unquestioned, like given facts about the world. But the biggest narrative question that is never answered is, where is Ash Ketchum's dad? Then Mario Odomo asks the other questions that would naturally follow, like, how does Ash feel about that? Is that the reason why Ash is traveling the world? Is it normal for him to travel the world if he's just a kid? Like, um treating that in like a very serious way and like kind of respecting that plot element of Pokemon. And I really love the zine because it's simultaneously poignant and tongue-in-cheek. And I find that 3 panel strips can fall flat or be too quickly digested. And I suppose it's ultimately kind of a silly zine. But I think Letters to an Absent Father really treats Ash's internal emotional life very seriously and like with a lot of tenderness. So the zine accomplishes this with some simple choices that make a pretty big impact. Like, for example, the narration is written from his perspective with really plain language, and it kind of lets the images contrast that narration by displaying little glimpses of detail in the more omniscient perspective. For example, the narration in this strip is simple and broad, but it's about how they're paired with the images and the reader being able to draw that connection that makes us understand Ash's thought process so well. And it's in those little details of the image where you can also tell Odomo brought a lot of love and imagination into this world. Like in this panel, the little visual details like the Psyduck camouflaging as a rock in the water are great. And it adds to the tender tone of the zine, not only towards Ash, but like towards the Pokemon franchise. So something I've also noticed is that the zine uses the contrast of sadness and humor really well to complicate an otherwise simple narrative. For example, like in this strip, it's like he's asking some very sad questions, but in the last panel of this strip, he kind of has like a really silly crying face, but like the rest of it is totally serious. So it kind of like plays with that push and pull or that tension of like humor and sadness really, really well. There's also the contrast of like a simply bubbly art style or the associated goofiness of the original franchise also comes into it. And that contrasts with the somewhat classically depressing premise of the zine, which is letters to an absent father. So there are multiple layers of contrast in both the humor and also the content, and that makes the sad parts sadder and the happy parts of the comic like more joyous. Yeah, it's just great because it builds so much emotional depth with such simple ingredients. Um, and there's also the framework of letter writing from a single person because you never know if the letters are reciprocated or even sent. So reading this when I was like 12 years old or whatever really affected me because I always wanted to seek out resolution. Like I always wanted to be there to be like a the end or to have like an epilogue to explain everything. I think that's like the natural instinct that a lot of kids have is they're curious to know how things are resolved. And I feel like a part of growing older is like being able to let go of that and trust that things will resolve themselves or be at peace with the fact that some things will never resolve. Um, and this comic handles that in a really beautiful way too. Um, in the sense that like in some ways this zine is opening up the story of Pokemon again and breaking it away from a resolution. It acknowledges the viewer or the player's itch of wondering what happens to Ash's father without actually scratching it. You know what I mean? The next zine I want to talk about is Smelt by Jane Mai. This comic was originally published by Piao Studio, but I'm counting it as a fanzine because it was one of the first books they ever published, I think. They were founded in 2012 and Smelt was published in 2013. So it very much looks, feels, and functions like a zine. So Podsmelt is an Animal Crossing fanzine. I originally became a Jane Mai fan through her book Sunday in the Park with Boys, which was published by Koyama Press here in Toronto. Something I've always really loved about her work is how she uses her persona as a character in personal stories. And it makes us consider the relationship between the character in the story and the author of the story. Um, like it makes us consider like the real life author who created it and how they're depicting themselves, which I think always adds like an interesting layer to how we read. um, Mai here is making evident the specificity of her experience with Animal Crossing by generating a full character and personality from the in-game villager avatar she used in her game. And I think that's the greatest appeal of this fanzine. Like, while she played the game, there was clearly a narrative developing in her head using the in-game NPCs as sort of puppets and the game itself as like a dollhouse. So it really feels gratifying to see that new story like just completely translated into comic form as its like own independent piece. Um, so like for example, Ponsmelt imagines Lobo as an outsider to the village because of his wolf pack's like nomadic lifestyle and the relationship between these different wolves. When in the actual game, it's like multiple villagers will have the same personality because they're all like programmed by type. But she kind of like imbues this whole character and backstory into her favorite villager, which is really awesome. Um, and it also builds on this mechanic in Animal Crossing that animal villagers can leave or get shuffled around, even if you really want them to stay. And this is like a source of tension in Smelt as well. And she's really good at playing up the precarious drama of that fact. So when the zine was actually published, I had never played the game and like I had never played Animal Crossing, but now that I'm flipping through the digital edition after having played it, there are like so many wonderful details to find. For example, the way villagers hoard the fish you give them inside their home is a programming quirk or something that Smelt transforms into a plot point about Lobo's avoidant personality, which you can see on this page. And the way Jane Mai's persona or avatar is drawn also seems unique. In stark contrast to the other villagers, she seems more realistically rendered. There's some like dimensional texture in her hair and eyes. Her facial proportions aren't as flat or exaggerated. And I've also like always found that Animal Crossing games kind of have this strange lilt to them because there are no other human characters other than the player. Like it feels self-aware in that sense because the only human is like the autonomous player controlled avatar. So in some ways I think that Plant Smelt like heightens this uncanny rift, and it opens up that darkness in this sweet and comforting game that's like designed for kids or whatever, and is able to like kind of pull it into that darker place by bringing out that element of alienation that was always present under the surface like in the design of the game, which is again super cool. um yeah, those are those are my favorite parts about Pond Smelt. um and finally I want to talk about the comic Lara, Croft Was My Family by Carta Monir. So this piece was published digitally through the Zeal project. I'm not sure if they're still active, but they crowdfunded interesting critical writing and comics about video games. And Carta Monir makes like such incredible work and is one of my and this is like one of my old favorites of hers. It's autobiographical and talks about a family, which I mean her family, uh, and how they played like Tomb Raider together in tandem with exploring the damage caused by a controlling and abusive father. So the story gets darker and darker as you read. The main narrative is told in brief vignettes with no narration, interspersed with like frames from Tomb Raider. And Lara Croft acts as a proxy for the woman the father controlled, literally because he was always the one behind the controller playing the game. Meanwhile, the other members of the family are like invested in Lara Croft's tribulations and successes. It's interesting because when you play a game like Raider, you can't always succeed the first time. Like they're designed so you have to die and then learn how to improve. And Lara Croft was my family holds a magnifying glass to this process of watching an avatar of a woman that you're controlling die and get hurt over and over again on screen. Because that is literally what's happening, but we're kind of desensitized to it. Um, and Monir is really good at like pulling that into the real world and like examining that element of the game from like a real world perspective. Um, and in one way, it is painful and frustrating to see such an obvious reflection of your failure, of like the player's inability to like advance the game or win the game. But in another way, there can be something very satisfying about seeing like your personal, emotional, or psychological pain manifest as physical pain on screen. Kind of gives like a voice to what you're feeling. And Monir's illustrating multiple perspectives at work here. There's the father who attempts to force the avatar to do his bidding. The avatar that might represent the mother is punished when she fails to perform his will. And then there's the onlookers, who are the children, and they're not empowered to stop the cycle, but have no choice but to watch it unfold in front of them and as it happens to them. So you could say that seeing this dynamic of control happen via Lara Croft as proxy gives a certain language to the abuse that occurred. Um, and I also really think that the way this comic represents time is effective. Like, the comic deals with some really heavy themes of trauma, but that representation never actually feels heavy handed. And I think it's because each moment of the story is very brief, accompanied by no narration, and it's like scattered throughout years and years of life. It's a super effective way of showing how harm and the memory of harm manifests even years after the fact, or how it like continues to manifest um like in your life, I guess, and how it changes if it does change. And we're the ones who are left, like we as readers are left to connect the gaps in time in the same way that the children by the end of the story are left to reckon with what happened to them. And the way that the story is told in these like flashes of moments feels similar to how the narrator remembers moments of Lara Croft's adventure through time, and by extension how we as players might remember significant moments of the game. So these brief snapshots really suit the subject matter, and really treat the subject matter in like a beautiful and respectful way. And ultimately, it's kind of like what I was talking about earlier. Like, why do we feel compelled to make fan work? This comic really successfully makes meaning and significance from experiences that might be painful to recall or seem meaningless and confusing. So, the power we give games to imbue meaning, resolution, or ask new questions of distressing memories is a really valuable element of generating a narrative response like this comic. So that's all I wanted to talk about today. I really love these three comic works, and you can buy or access all of them online if you're interested. Being able to see into someone else's relationship with a game that you are familiar with adds, I think, a whole new dimension to how I remember that original work. And I think fanzines are a tool that we can use to reshape our experiences and change the way that we remember and play games. And ultimately can also just be like a source of pleasure and fulfillment. So thank you all so much for listening. If you have any other narrative fanzine recommendations, or if you have thoughts on why you like to make narrative fan work, please send all of that my way. Take care and happy reading.